the collector of shadows in a dark corner of the city, where narrow streets were shrouded in mist and the thick branches of old trees, there stood a gloomy house. Its windows were boarded up, and its doors were bound by rusty chains. The house had long been abandoned, and everyone who had ever heard of its sinister owner avoided it. That owner was Victor Hartz, the collector of shadows, as the locals called him in rare conversations. Victor Hartz was a reclusive, quiet man. No one knew where he had come from or what he did before moving into the house. Some said he had been a scientist studying the mysteries of the human mind, while others claimed he had worked in a morgue and been fired for strange experiments on the bodies of the dead. But everyone agreed on one thing: his passion for collecting had long crossed the boundaries of normalcy. Victor did not collect antiques or rare books. He collected corpses, not just any dead bodies, but those whose deaths were filled with a special kind of horror, whose departure from the world of the living had been marked by something sinister, leaving scars on their souls. He believed that such bodies retained something unique, a kind of essence that could be possessed. Every night, Victor went out in search of his exhibits. His collection began with nameless wanderers he picked up by the roadside and gradually expanded to more elaborate victims. He hunted for those who had died in agony, those who had left the world unexpectedly, those who had experienced true terror in their final moments. The first find, Victor's first body, was found by accident. He was returning home from one of his nightly walks when he saw her, a young woman lying in the bushes on the edge of the forest. Her eyes were wide open, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. Victor was mesmerized by the sight. Her skin was covered in patterns of wounds and scratches, as if her body had become some strange, sick piece of art. He stopped and stared at her, feeling something new within himself, a strange excitement, cold and piercing, that coursed down his spine. He knew he had to take her with him. This woman was the first find, but not the last. Victor carried her to his car, wrapping her in an old blanket, and when he arrived home, he took her down to the basement. There, he set up his first museum. He prepared her body with incredible care, as if getting it ready for an exhibition. He spent hours examining her eyes, her mutilated arms and legs, her broken fingers. He felt a strange sense of satisfaction spreading through his veins as he gazed upon her, as if her death was imparting something deep, something eternal to him. The collection grew soon. Victor's basement began filling up with new exhibits. He collected bodies from local cemeteries, waiting for night to fall before sneaking into the abandoned sections where graves were rarely visited. He hunted old, lonely men living on the outskirts of the city and poor laborers returning home late at night. He would track their movements, waiting for the moment when they were alone and vulnerable. Sometimes Victor orchestrated their deaths to seem accidental. A lonely old man stumbling down a flight of stairs, a drunk drowning in a ditch, an unfortunate fall in an abandoned building. But none of these deaths were accidental. Victor planned them carefully to ensure his collection grew. He stored the bodies in sealed metal containers, maintaining a specific temperature to preserve them for as long as possible. Each body had its own peculiarity. One young man had died falling from the 9th floor window, his body mutilated as if gnawed by wild beasts. Another woman was found drowned in a river, her face frozen in such an expression of horror that it seemed she had seen something unimaginable before her death. Victor meticulously catalogued his finds. He kept books with records of each body, age, gender, circumstances of death, distinctive marks. He took photographs, created maps, and diagrams. His basement turned into a strange laboratory where death had its own life. The discovery of a secret power. One day, Victor noticed that one of the bodies in his collection had changed. It was the body of an old man he had found on the outskirts of the city. Victor saw that the corpse's eyes were slightly open, although he was certain they had been tightly shut before. A faint, eerie smile had appeared on the man's face, barely noticeable but still terrifying in its lifeless expression. Victor began spending more time in the basement, studying these changes. He soon noticed that every body in his collection was beginning to change somehow. What started with subtle movements of fingers or eyelids grew into a full sensation of movement when he turned his back. Shadows in the basement began playing with him. They danced, whispered, laughed in the silence of the night. Soon, Victor realized his collection was alive. The bodies of the dead were filled with some strange energy he could not explain. He understood that their deaths were not just a transition to another world, but that something remained here, among the shadows and emptiness. Inevitable retribution. One night, in the middle of the night, Victor was awakened by a strange noise coming from the basement. It sounded like the rustling of many feet touching the cold stone floor. He grabbed a flashlight and descended, his hands trembling, his heart pounding wildly. When he opened the basement door, the beam of the flashlight illuminated an incredible sight. All the bodies he had so carefully collected were standing. They stood in a tight group, their eyes fixed on him, empty and dark like bottomless wells. Their mouths were half open, emitting a quiet, barely discernible whisper, as if they were speaking in a language he could not understand. Victor staggered back, trying to close the door, but the bodies began to move. Slowly, heavily, they advanced toward him. Their eyes, once lifeless, now burned with a bright fire of hatred and anger. Victor felt screams and moans begin to echo in his head, like thousands of voices crying out from the darkness. He tried to run, but his legs buckled, and he fell to his knees. Cold hands, like icy tentacles, reached out for him. He felt shadows touching his skin, felt cold air burst from his lungs, and the screams grew louder. The shadows consumed him. The house consumed him. Victor Hance was never seen again. His disappearance became an urban legend, and the house where he had lived became a cursed place. No one dared to approach it. They said that at night, quiet whispers could be heard from its walls, like crying and laughter at the same time. And those who heard these whispers would forever forget the way home. Conclusion: the legend of the Collector of Shadows spread throughout the city. Residents avoided the street where Victor Hance's house stood. Yet sometimes, in the quiet of the night, one could hear soft footsteps and a sinister whisper, as if the house itself had become part of his dark collection.